Hello. In the Crown of Aragon, 639 years ago, it was April 17th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companione. We're talking about a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Today's document appears to be a pretty straightforward one. It's from Violant, and it is from Register 1819, which is a register labeled Varia. Gotta love that Varia. All kinds of stuff in there. So it's basically addressed to two Treasury officials. One is a person that we've encountered in the podcast before, Anthony Rosar. And he's been tasked with just kind of humdrum activities, it seems, like showing up to places, collecting the taxes, pay this person the money, that kind of thing. The other person I think has showed up a little bit before also. His name is Jacme Scriva. So the last name is something like Brighter. So I kind of like it. Or like Scribe, like last name Scribe. Interesting. So this particular letter caught my eye because right away on the first line of the main text of the letter, we have Sapiat que la illustri na Sibilla mujer del Signore pare nostra. You know that the illustrious Lady Sibilla, wife of the King our Father. That's what that first phrase says, and it's Violant who's writing it. So this is something about Queen Sibilla. Now, as we get into this later part of April, things get intense regarding Queen Sibilla. So two of her advisors are executed at the end of April. I got thrown off by what unfortunately is an error in a footnote. And that particular error got me pretty confused about the timeline because I was looking at some documents from the very end of April and it didn't seem to match up with that date. And I just want to foreground this by saying that there is so much research and detail that goes into the historical scholarship, and that when I find some kind of little typo, I know that it should no way be interpreted as the historian being in any way of lower caliber. I have seen the most brilliant and dedicated and detailed historians accidentally put in the number 1 when they mean the number 2. Or some kind of accidental correction at one point ends up an accidental correction, an accidental edit at one point ends up being corrected in a way that wasn't the way it was supposed to be. There's just all of these different ways that little typos can happen. And so I will be saying where the typo has occurred, but I in no way want that to come across as me thinking any less of the scholar, because this scholar is awesome. This particular scholar is super inspiring to me and has done brilliant work on the Crown of Aragon right around this time. So the article that has this little typo in a footnote is the one about Sibilla de Fortià, written by Núria Sierras Fernandez in an essay collection from 2010. And it's like at the very end of the footnotes, and it basically says that the two advisors of Sibilla de Fortià were executed on April 19th. The actual date in the sources that are listed there in that footnote, the two sources say April 29th. So it was just a simple thing of it was 29 instead of 19. It really doesn't, in the grand scheme of things, matter when you're trying to get a broad idea and even a detailed idea of the reign of Joan in these early months in the first year. It's just because I chose to do a podcast of a document a day that the day-to-day chronology is of heightened importance to me. But I am in no way saying that it is a requirement to know, like down to the day, what really happened on each individual day in order to have a very solid comprehension of overall what were the tensions, the problems, the questions, and the arguments that were taking place at the time. So it's a really interesting relationship to fact that historians have. On the one hand, I would never advocate for just playing fast and loose with the facts. But on the other, being obsessed with minute factual content can actually do a disservice to the explanation. So the task of the historian is to make sense of what happened in the past, to create a representation from incomplete data as best as can be done. And so when that is the focus, as opposed to some kind of very nitpicky approach, then things like this, they are completely understandable and in no ways diminish the quality of the historical scholarship. So that might be controversial to some people, but I'm just trying to say that you can have a typo, you can get a date wrong, and your historical analysis could still be absolutely superb and a model for everybody else to follow. And that's how I think of the scholarship of Núria Sierras Fernandez. Okay, April 29th is the date that these advisors of Sibilla de Fortià, there's two, they get executed. One of them is named Limes. I think it's Bartolomeo Limes. The other one is named Bernat Abello. Okay. Those are the two that get executed. They're the ones that are like made examples of. And we know this because of Hieronymo Zorita. Hieronymo Zorita wrote a history of this time in the Crown of Aragon, as well as like other reigns, but he did in detail write about the reign of Joan and Violant. He was writing in the very early 17th century. So he was writing around the year 1600. There is an edition of his book on the history of the Crown of Aragon that Google Books has digitized. And I will put a link to it in the episode page for today's episode. What's really interesting is to see the conventions of early printed books and just to kind of appreciate just, oh my gosh, in 1600, it had already been over 100 years since all of this had happened. And Hieronymo Zurita is going in and looking at, I think, a lot of these same documents that I'm looking at. And then from 1600 to 1660, which is the publication of the edition that I have access to, well, that was another 60 years, longer than I have been alive. And then from 1660 to today, well, that is even more time. It's over 300 years. So, basically, there's just this vastness in the historical project here that is super interesting for me to engage with. What's really nice is that there is a digitized transcription of Zurita's history. It was produced in 2003 by the Institución Fernando el Católico, and it is a digital edition coordinated by a scholar named Iso, and basically someone typed it all out. I think they might have done some automated text recognition, but it could have been that someone typed it all out. And so we've got a really easy to read version that I'll also link to in the bibliography for today's episode on that webpage for today's episode. All right, so Zurita was looking at documents, some of the same documents that I'm looking at right now. But he, I think, had access to documents that have since been lost, because no one else in the subsequent scholarship has been able to link the event of the execution to a particular archival document. And Zurita does not do that. He does not cite the archival documents in his book. So that was just not expected at the time. If you're a historian writing in the year 1600, you're not expected in your narrative to put in footnotes. So we don't know where Zurita got the date of April 29th. And we don't know if there's some document out there that still exists that we could consult. I mean, when I say we, I'm just saying me and the scholars that have written about Sibilla de Fortià have not put any additional documents in their bibliographies or their footnotes. So I can't locate documents, at least so far, that mention the actual execution. We do have today's document, though, which mentions something that took place as sort of like an initial first step in the punishment of some of Sibilla's associates, and then ended up culminating in execution for two of them. Interestingly, in this document, in the second line toward the end, we have one of the two that would eventually be executed, but not the other. We have Bernard Abello mentioned. In this document, the Treasury officials are instructed to take all of the property, both the real estate property as well as just the possessions of this list of Queen Sibilla's associates. Bernard Abello is one of them, and to confiscate them. And that is the purpose of this document, to dispossess some of the people who were close associates of Sibilla and potentially helped her in her fleeing from Barcelona after it became clear in the very end of December that Per the Ceremonious was about to die. So they helped, possibly these people listed here helped her to flee, and along with her brother. All right. So we don't have any details in this document about the crimes or the misdeeds. It's all just listing out the practical details of how Antoni Rosar and Jacme Scrivia, they're going to be confiscating the possessions and the real estate properties. So that's this document. It is a step toward a very, very intense culmination that happens at the end of the month. Now, why is it that at the end of the month these folks are executed, the two, Bernat Abello and Bartolomeo Limes? And why is the punishment ramping up now in April? It has to do with Joan's sickness. Listen to this. I'm going to read out a portion of what Zorita wrote in the work that he produced, remember, a century later in 1600, but he had the benefit of the documents that maybe have since been lost. Okay, here we go. Oh, let me tell you the page number. So this is from 390R, and it's information about Joan becoming gravely ill, and it's not exactly dated, so we don't know if this is about January, but I think it's about April. All right, here's what Zorita wrote, translated into English. King Joan became gravely ill. He became convinced that his stepmother had bewitched him, and she was placed in great danger. It came to pass that following the queen's imprisonment, and after the king had arrived at Barcelona and his malady had worsened, that through the inquiries being conducted against the queen and her adherents, and based on various witness depositions, it was revealed that sundry spells, how do we want to translate that? I'm reading out of a kind of automated translation here. Diversos. Sundry spells had been concocted against the king's health and life at the behest and will of his stepmother, and his illness continued to intensify, placing his health and life in grave peril. And as some of his physicians opined that he had indeed been bewitched, the king's council, acting under this pretext, resolved that without awaiting formal conclusion or legal proceedings, and without regard for the fact that the Queen Sibilla and the other accused parties were actively defending themselves against the charges, the Queen and all the others should be subjected to torture regarding the matter of the spells. And so it was done. All right, so that's what Zorita says, and I'm going to be looking out for documents that corroborate that there was an order to torture Queen Sibilla. Zorita would be invested in making the history as exciting as possible and amping up the drama, because by this time there's a market for books and you want your book to be exciting. So, all right, am I justified in that implication that Zorita is going to amp things up and exaggerate? I think so because, this wasn't a time when we had like standards for scholarship. I mean, this is around the time that, stuff's being written like Shakespearean stuff. Like, look at Shakespeare's history plays. Like, they're presenting history, but it's in no way historically accurate. And then the sources that Shakespeare's... But I know that Shakespeare is intending to have a dramatic performance, and that Zarita doesn't have the intention of having dramatic performance, but there was a certain allowance for having things more dramatic than the details in the documents might have been presenting. So I'm not going to say that Zarita was a bad scholar and amping things up in order to make it more exciting necessarily, but I am saying that people who wrote histories and the genre of history at this time was not one that we know today as having this factual responsibility. It was more about, I guess, entertainment value. I'm feeling really uncomfortable as I'm talking about this because I don't want to slander Zarita without really knowing what I'm talking about. And I honestly haven't done a lot of research into the publishing culture of Spain in the year 1600. So I'm out on a limb with this. But I just need to say it because, if you're going to say that you tortured your stepmother, I think you should have something in the documents to substantiate that. And so not just somebody who I don't know. I'm really struggling with that. All right, we're going to move on with the reading here because the next part is even more dramatic. Okay, here's the next part. Among the various investigations, and this is still Zarita, among the various investigations undertaken in this case, a certain Jew who was himself under inquiry for the very same offense, so someone who had been associated with Sibilla, I guess. This Jew testified that the king was in truth bewitched. With great confidence, the Jew asserted that the king would not die of this malady, but would instead recover through the use of certain remedies that he, the Jew, would provide. The Jew even specified the exact day upon which the king would begin to convalesce, as well as a subsequent date by which he would be fully restored to health, free of the affliction and able to ride a horse. And with remarkable swiftness, every detail unfolded precisely as predicted by that Jew, down to the very hour and minute. Okay, so that's another passage from Zarita. Now, that last bit there, down to the very hour and the minute, it had been predicted. Was that in the document? Was that in the part of the archive of the Crown of Aragon that Zarita consulted? Was it? If it was, that's interesting. But there's no way for us to know because he doesn't cite the archival document. And it seems really amped up. And it is got this additional angle of the interfaith encounter. So what does it mean for Zarita to attribute this to a Jew? And what would it have meant for Joan to be getting advice from a Jew at this time? These are different questions. So for Zarita, it might have been a nod toward a certain exoticism because it is a long time since the Jews were expelled from Spain, like 1492. And it's 1600 when Zarita is writing. For Joan, though, this is an interfaith context. Johann had Jewish doctors from his earliest days. As an infant, there are records of Johann having Jewish doctors give him medicines and advise him on illness. So this would have been a normal thing. And whatever this prognostication was, if it actually did happen, then we might hear it alluded to in a letter from Violant that she wrote on May 4th. And that is one where she explicitly says that Johann had had curses and sorcery put on him. So it is getting really intense. And that was Ghost, who did a little mew at the intensity. Oh my gosh. All right, I do need to add in one quick AI usage note. So I was very stumped by the name of the person who appears in this document on line 2, right before Bernat Abello. It was clearly something like Pelegri so it's Mossen. Mossen is really clear, and then Pelegri de, and then it's really hard to figure out what the letters are before the C or the T, and then there's an AGUT. So I was like, is this some kind of like really sloppy way of writing Montagut? And I was like, no, like that is just not it. There's no way that there could be an L there, because it would not be eliminated and replaced by a macron. The L's, they almost are always writing out. So I was really stumped, like, is that an N-I something? It was really hard. So what I did is I went to the data that I had compiled from all of the OpenClaw pipeline work for Register 1819, and I typed in Pelegri. And what's interesting is that I came up with a search result from right on the same folio. I had not yet looked down at what was included next on this folio. It's like a Latin version of this same document with maybe a couple other specifics, as best I can tell, but it almost looks like a Latin translation. So that's interesting. But in there, we have another version, the Latin version of this person's name, with in line 4 of the document that's on the second half of this folio, Pegrinum de, and then this looks like Monte. It's a very clear M, and then Acuto, Monte Acuto. And then we've got Milite. So this person is a knight. And then we have Bernardum Abello. So they're paired together again. So I came back up to the document for today and looked at line 2 and said that could actually be an M, where the second half of the letter is like just faint. And I put that together and said, okay, I think this person's last name is something like Montagu. So I am going to go with Montagut as the last name of this person. And I was able to make the breakthrough that could be just a very faintly written letter M, because OpenClaw had done an automated text recognition with good enough quality to draw my attention down to the next document on this folio. So yesterday I was talking about problems with AI, and today I have an example of useful. So the jury is out on AI. The jury is not going to have one final verdict. It's all just It's all just messy, complicated, sometimes useful, sometimes very detrimental. Yeah, well, that's just where we are with the AI these days. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara companiona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document, an image of the pages from the 1660 edition of Zorita that I had read out from. And also there will be the additional show notes, bibliographic citations. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.